The city of Helric shimmered beneath the pale, twin moons, its towering structures of organic glass reflecting the starlight. The night air was thick with the scent of ionized ozone and the distant hum of energy coursing through the veins of the city. It was a world unlike any other, where the ancient and the future coexisted in a delicate, unspoken balance. But for Jonathan Carter, a human diplomat on a high-stakes mission, this planet felt more like an alien maze than the advanced civilization it was meant to be. And then there was her. Princess Lyra of the Zorith people, blind, exiled, and shunned, sat upon her throne in the midst of this opulent yet suffocating world. The weight of centuries-old traditions and unspoken judgments lay heavily upon her shoulders. Her sightless eyes, pools of darkness, had once glowed with the promise of future leadership. But the incident, the one that cost her the ability to see and left her vulnerable, had shattered not just her vision but her people's faith in her. To them, she was a relic of a broken past, something to be hidden away. Jonathan had only heard whispers about her, vague stories that painted her as a crippled princess, incapable of ruling. The assignment he had been given was straightforward: broker peace with the Zorith, and secure an alliance with that powerful nation. But he hadn't been briefed on her, or how it would feel to stand before someone who held such an aura of quiet strength despite the odds stacked against her. He stepped into the grand hall, his boots clicking softly against the polished stone floor. The guards, motionless like statues, allowed him to pass without a word. At the center of the room, Lyra sat alone in the dimly lit space, her dark hair cascading down her shoulders like a veil of midnight. She didn't hear him approach, yet the air around her seemed to shift, aware of his presence. "You're late," she said, her voice calm but edged with a quiet authority. Jonathan stood frozen, struck by the power in her voice. There was no hint of fear or hesitation, only a confident command of the space. She hadn't even turned to face him. "My apologies, Your Highness," Jonathan said, stepping forward. "The council took longer than expected." "I know," she replied, her voice softening just slightly. "But time is not as precious to me as it is to you, Earthling." Jonathan frowned, confused. "You know who I am?" "Of course. Your scent is different, more earthy," she said with a slight smile. "And the way you walk. You're not from here. But I've heard much about you and your people. I've also heard your purpose here. The questions in your eyes. The judgment you hide behind polite words." Jonathan was taken aback by her insight. There was something disarming in the way she spoke, as though she could sense the very thoughts he tried to suppress. Her blindness did not seem to dull her perception. In fact, it was as if she saw more clearly than most. "I don't judge you," Jonathan said, trying to regain his composure. "I'm here to ensure peace." "Peace?" she echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You speak of peace, but what of those who've been left behind in the name of peace? I am nothing but a symbol of failure." He felt a pang of regret. "I don't believe that's true," he said, the sincerity in his voice surprising even him. "The Zorith people. They have abandoned me," she interrupted, her voice rising, filled with quiet rage. "I was their heir. I was their future. And when I fell, they cast me aside. Their cowardice is my cage. Their blindness is my prison." Jonathan felt a sudden shift in the room, a tension crackling in the air. Despite her blindness, she was acutely aware of everything around her, sensing each shift in his posture, each subtle change in the energy between them. He stepped closer, unsure of what drew him to her, but the words tumbled out before he could stop them. "I think they're wrong," he said softly. "I think you have the strength to lead. It's not the sight that makes a ruler, but the heart." For a moment there was silence. Her breathing slowed, almost imperceptible. And then she laughed again, a sound that felt like a breath from another world. "You think so?" she asked, her voice curious but skeptical. "I do." She finally turned toward him. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes were hollow, but there was an intensity there, something fierce, something untouched by the pity the world had cast upon her. "Then prove it," she said, her voice low, challenging. Prove to me that you see more than just a broken princess. The challenge hung between them like a tangible force. Jonathan felt the weight of it, and yet, there was something in her that pulled at him. Her vulnerability, yes, but more than that, her strength. Her resilience in the face of everything that had been taken from her. Before he could respond, a low rumble echoed through the palace, and the ground trembled. Jonathan's instincts kicked in, and he reached out to steady her. What was that? A shiver passed through Lyra's frame. It's them, she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. They've come for me. Jonathan's heart raced as he realized what she meant. He had walked into a far more dangerous game than he had ever anticipated. The tremor shook the palace once more, the ground beneath Jonathan's feet quaking with a menacing, rhythmic thrum. The distant sounds of armored boots echoed through the halls, followed by the sharp clink of weapons. This wasn't an isolated disturbance, it was a warning. And Lyra, though blind, felt it with an intensity that made Jonathan's pulse spike. They've come, she repeated, her voice eerily calm. There was no panic, only an undeniable resolve. Jonathan's heart raced as the realization dawned. The political unrest he had been sent to quell had now morphed into a much darker, more personal conflict. This wasn't just about securing a peace treaty anymore. This was a battle for the throne, and Lyra's very life. What should we do? Jonathan asked, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting answers to appear in the shifting shadows of the grand chamber. But the princess stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly, listening to the distant footsteps as if they were her own heartbeat. I've known this moment would come, Lyra said, her voice full of quiet determination. I will not hide. Not anymore. Jonathan stepped closer, his thoughts swirling. But you're not in a position to fight back. I do not need saving, she interrupted, her voice hardening. The words cut through him like an accusation, but he held his ground, forcing his breath to steady. She turned her face toward him, her expression unreadable despite her blindness. There is no honor in surrender, Jonathan. You came here to negotiate. But your mission is nothing compared to the truth I've lived for years. Before he could respond, the chamber doors flew open with a violent crash. A group of armored guards, their faces cold and unreadable, stepped into the room. Their heavy boots clattered against the stone, their weapons gleaming under the dim light of the room. Jonathan instinctively moved to shield Lyra, but she stopped him with a raised hand. Don't, she murmured. These are not my enemies, not yet. One of the guards, a tall man with a scar running down his face, stepped forward. His voice was low and controlled, but there was a sharpness to it. Princess Lyra, you are under arrest for treason against the throne. Your rule has ended. Come peacefully, and no harm will come to you. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The treason they spoke of was not a true crime. It was a betrayal, a political maneuver to remove her from power, disguised as justice. The realization hit him hard, but he kept his eyes on the guards, unwilling to show his shock. Lyra stood unfazed. I will not go quietly, nor will I be bound by the chains of their lies. The guard's eyes flickered for a brief moment, before he nodded to his comrades. The group began to advance, closing the distance between them and the princess. Jonathan felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His mission had always been one of diplomacy, but diplomacy was slipping through his fingers. This wasn't a matter of policy or treaties. This was life and death. His pulse quickened, and his gaze shifted from the guards to Lyra. There was no fear in her eyes, only a fiery determination. It was that look, the one that dared the universe to challenge her, that had drawn him to her in the first place. I'm not leaving you, Jonathan said, stepping forward, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. Lyra turned toward him, her unseeing eyes meeting his with an intensity that spoke volumes. Then stay with me, she said simply. But know this, if you choose to stay, there is no turning back. The words were a promise and a warning all at once, but Jonathan's resolve had already solidified. He wasn't just standing here for peace anymore. He was standing here for her. Without another word, Lyra moved. Swift, fluid and precise, her every step was calculated, even in the face of danger. Jonathan followed her lead, his instincts kicking in. The guards, slow to react, began to circle them like wolves, weapons raised. But Lyra, despite her blindness, seemed to anticipate their every move. She raised her hand, and the guards hesitated, confused for a brief moment by her eerie confidence. That hesitation was all they needed. With a sudden burst of speed, Jonathan lunged at the nearest guard, knocking him off balance. The others reacted too late, and Lyra's sharp, controlled movements made quick work of two more. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as he fought side by side with the princess, but his mind was still reeling. What had happened to her? This wasn't the same woman he had met earlier, unsure and shrouded in shadows. She was a force of nature, a commander of her fate. And yet, despite her strength, Jonathan could sense the isolation in her, the burden of years of silence, of being overlooked. With the guards dispatched, the room fell silent. But the quiet was a tense one, filled with unsaid words and unresolved emotions. Jonathan exhaled slowly. "What now?" Lyra paused, her breath steadying as she felt her way through the room. "Now we move forward. Together." But before they could take another step, a voice rang out from the doorway. "You think this is over, Princess?" Jonathan turned to face the new threat, his body tense with readiness. But what he saw made his blood run cold. Standing in the doorway was a figure shrouded in a dark cloak, their face obscured by a veil. A figure Jonathan recognized, a political figure from the Zorith court. The same one who had orchestrated her fall. "Your real trial," the cloaked figure said, "is only just beginning." The flickering lights of the chamber cast long, twisting shadows on the walls, creating an eerie stillness. Jonathan's pulse thudded in his ears as the cloaked figure spoke, their voice cold and unyielding. Every part of him screamed to act, to charge forward and end this once and for all, but Lyra's calm presence steadied him. "Do you recognize this one?" she asked, her voice low, her head tilted toward the figure. Jonathan's gaze never wavered from the newcomer, his body taut, prepared for anything. "Yes," he said slowly. "It's Collar. A high-ranking member of the Zorith Council. He's one of the ones responsible for your exile." Lyra's mouth tightened into a grim line, her lips barely moving. "I should have known. He's the architect of my downfall." Collar stepped forward, his dark cloak swishing with each deliberate step, the glint of the insignia on his chest catching the light. The symbol was unmistakable, the mark of betrayal, a fractured circle. "You should have stayed in your place, Princess." Collar's voice was a sneer, dripping with contempt. "But now you've made it personal." "Personal?" Jonathan's tone was sharp as he stepped in front of Lyra, instinctively protecting her from Collar's poisonous words. "This was never about politics for you, was it? It was about power. Manipulating the people who trusted you to further your own ambitions." Collar's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You have no idea what you're talking about, human. This isn't your fight." Jonathan's fingers flexed at his sides, the frustration and anger building within him. He wanted to lash out, to take control of the situation, but Lyra's calm voice interrupted his rising tension. "Enough," she said, her voice steady as a rock, though Jonathan could feel the subtle tremor in it. "I've heard enough of your lies, Collar. You will not break me. You will not make me cower in your shadow." Collar's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, the briefest sign of uncertainty. But it was enough. Jonathan saw it, felt it. This was not a man used to being confronted, especially not by someone like Lyra, someone he had underestimated for far too long. "You think you have control of this situation?" Collar said, stepping forward again, his eyes flickering to Jonathan with disdain. "You will find that there are forces at play here far greater than your strength, or your loyalty." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Collar's grin returned, colder now, like a predator sensing his prey's weakening resolve. "You've made a fatal mistake, human. You've chosen a side in a game you don't understand. And now, you'll see the consequences." The words hung in the air, suffocating the room. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat, but before he could respond, a low rumble echoed through the palace, much deeper and more menacing than before. The ground trembled again, and this time it wasn't just a warning, it was an impending storm. Lyra's hand moved, as if she could feel the vibrations running through the very stone beneath her. Her fingers clenched into a fist, and Jonathan saw the flicker of determination in her face. "What's happening?" he demanded. "They're here," Lyra whispered, her voice now full of quiet dread. "The real threat. It's not just Collar. He's only the first piece." Jonathan's eyes shot back to Collar, his mind racing. "What do you mean? Who else is involved?" Collar laughed, a cruel sound that grated against Jonathan's nerves. "You'll find out soon enough. The game has only just begun." Before Jonathan could speak, the palace doors slammed open, and several figures entered, figures cloaked in darkness, their faces concealed by elaborate masks. They moved with precision, their presence suffocating, as if they belonged to the shadows themselves. The room seemed to shrink with every step they took, the temperature dropping as if the very air was being sucked from the space. Lyra stepped back, her posture rigid but poised. "They're here. The Veiler, assassins who serve only those with power enough to hire them. And they're here for me." Jonathan's blood ran cold. The Veiler were legends among the Zorith. Merciless, elusive, and deadly. Known to never miss their mark, their reputation was built on silent executions and a cold, efficient brutality. He'd heard whispers of them, never in person, never close enough to feel the full weight of their terror. But now, standing in the same room with them, he could feel the dread they exuded, palpable in the air. "How many?" Jonathan asked, his voice strained. Lyra's lips pressed together in a thin line. "Too many to count," she replied. "And they will not stop until I'm dead." Jonathan stepped closer to her, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel her strength, her resolve, but beneath that, the flicker of fear, the fear of not surviving this. Fear that she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge until now. She had been alone for so long, fighting a battle she thought she would lose, a battle against the very people who once held her close. And now, with the Veiler closing in, she faced an enemy that would not hesitate to destroy her. But Jonathan was done being passive. He wasn't here to stand by while Lyra fought her battles alone. "Not today," Jonathan muttered to himself. His mind was already racing, strategizing, calculating. He wasn't a warrior by nature, but he had faced his own battles. And he had no intention of losing this one. Lyra turned her head toward him, sensing his change in demeanor. "Jonathan, you don't have to." But he was already moving, pulling her behind him, positioning himself between her and the Veiler. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice low but steady. "We'll get through this. Together." As the Veiler closed in, the tension in the room reached a boiling point. The first assassin's hand reached for the blade at his waist, the gleam of steel catching the low light. Jonathan's heart hammered against his ribcage. This was it, the moment when everything would either shatter or fall into place. And as the first strike was launched, Jonathan knew one thing for certain. He was not going to let her face this alone. The palace was a battlefield now. Chaos spun through the once grand halls as the Veiler encircled them, shadows clinging to their every movement. Jonathan's heart raced, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a vice. His mind screamed for a plan, for action, but all he had was the need to protect her, to keep Lyra alive. The Veiler moved like a ripple through water, coordinated, precise, their blades gleaming like the promise of death. They were silent, but their presence was deafening, their eyes hidden beneath masks that told nothing of their intentions. There were at least 5 of them now, surrounding them, trapping them with every passing second. Lyra's breath was steady, controlled, but Jonathan could feel the tension in her every movement. She hadn't spoken since the Veiler entered, but her energy pulsed with the same force he had seen in her before, determined, unyielding. Yet this time, Jonathan could sense a flicker of doubt, a hesitation he hadn't noticed in her before. She had always been the strong one, the one who led with unshakable conviction. But now, Faced with the reality of death closing in, he saw her vulnerability. The fight to survive was no longer just physical, it was emotional, too. The betrayal she'd faced, the isolation that had defined her life for so long, had led her to this moment. "Stay close to me," Jonathan said, his voice low and commanding as he positioned himself between her and the advancing assassins. His hand reached for his sidearm, but his mind told him the weapon was useless in this battle. The Vela would be too quick, too precise for anything but the rawest form of combat. Lyra nodded, the briefest flicker of gratitude passing through her features. "I'm not afraid of them," she said, her voice stronger now. "But I don't want you to die for me." Jonathan turned to face her, his eyes searching hers, trying to find some way to reassure her, but he couldn't. Words weren't enough anymore. The space between them felt both infinite and suffocating. The gravity of the moment held them in place, and everything, the future, their unspoken connection, the endless war for survival, was distilled into this one fragile instant. "Then don't let me," Jonathan said, his voice quieter but fierce. "We fight together, or we don't fight at all." For the first time since their fateful meeting, Lyra's expression softened. Her hand, which had been clenched tightly by her side, moved subtly toward his, and for just a heartbeat they stood, side by side. The unspoken bond between them was palpable, forged through the fires of shared conflict. In this moment, they weren't just two individuals caught in a dangerous game, they were partners, allies, something more. And then the Vela attacked. It was a blur of motion, silent, swift, deadly. The first assassin lunged with a dagger aimed at Jonathan's throat, but he was faster. He ducked, spinning to the side, narrowly avoiding the blade. He shoved his elbow into the Vela's stomach, sending him crashing into the marble pillars that lined the room. Lyra, never one to falter, reacted immediately. She raised her hand, her movements almost poetic, but with an edge of ruthlessness Jonathan hadn't seen before. She struck the second assassin across the chest, her palm connecting with a resounding force that sent him stumbling backward. Her training, her years of survival, came to the forefront in that moment, no longer the fragile princess, but a warrior whose every move was a testament to her strength. Jonathan fought beside her, their movements perfectly synchronized, like they had practiced this for years. He dispatched another assassin with a quick jab to the throat, sending him to the floor with a quiet gasp. But there were still 3 left, and they were closing in fast. Lyra's breath was shallow, her body coiled like a spring, ready to strike again, but the weight of exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. Jonathan saw it, the slight tremor in her hand, the tightening of her jaw. She was pushing herself harder than ever before. He knew she had been running on adrenaline, but he couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could keep it up. "We can't keep this up," he muttered, barely dodging a strike from the third assassin. "We need to get out of here." "We don't have time for escape," Lyra replied, her voice steady despite the chaos. She was right. There was no running now, no hiding. This fight was their last stand. The final Veiler, a massive figure, stepped forward, his blade gleaming with a deadly edge. The room fell silent as he advanced, the other assassins lying incapacitated or dead at their feet. Lyra and Jonathan stood back to back, breathing heavily, their eyes locked on the looming threat. This was it, the moment they would either overcome or fall. The Veiler's eyes, hidden behind the cold, reflective mask, flickered with a slight recognition. "You are strong," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the stone beneath them. "But it will not be enough." Jonathan could feel the weight of those words. The Vela was a predator, and they were his prey. But there was something in Jonathan, something that had always been there, that refused to yield. The life he had known, Earth, the politics, the missions, had all led him to this moment. And this woman beside him, this princess who was more than any title could describe, was worth every ounce of his strength. "We'll see about that," Jonathan said, his voice low and dangerous. With a roar, the Vela lunged, his blade aiming directly at Jonathan's chest. But Lyra was faster. With a cry that was both a battle shout and a cry of release, she moved in front of Jonathan, her body becoming a blur of motion, a flash of strength and defiance. The clash of steel rang out, echoing through the hall. And in that moment, Jonathan realized one truth. No matter what happened next, they would never be the same again.